The ass in the coffee might help you come
I feel like you just said some science words.
in. Came in here, it's like probably half it to the bottom. All I know is I could have 30 minutes for class to make coffee. Destroy my
I'm just assuming experiment. What are the breakdown on the sugar that goes?
I feel like you just have to have like
I'm not getting a lot, for sure.
Hey, you gotta let me know, or I'll talk to you for that. Like, when we find like a weekend that'll work for you, and if that's not true,
Dude, I'm in. I'm so in. I saw the tree like with a giant hole in it. That whole tree. Yeah, that was hilarious. That also is very. It cannot be like. I didn't put those like me fire. Yeah. I didn't put. I told her I was like, my car has that whole thing right now. And I played the video. Good morning, dude. Oh man, I'm so glad you're here. I saw that every day. I'm gonna work my way around. Judd! What up? Good morning. All right. Good morning. We're gonna start. A few things for you before we. Let's see. A few things for you before we get started on class is one. Thank you very much to the girls who helped with the towels and the widow banquet. There's a widow banquet on yesterday, and some of you helped. Some of the girls helped like stitch up towels and stuff for. I just killed a ladybug. He stitched up towels and stuff for widows, and they were very appreciative, and they thought they were very cool and pretty. And so, thank you for that. Y'all have actually, several of you have really been killing it with all, like I ended last semester by saying like, y'all are doing so good, like helping and serving and stuff, and y'all have really kept it up, and so that's awesome. I'm really proud of you. And it's a good way to learn how to be a member of the church now, so that later, like you can really be involved. So when you go on somewhere else, you can be ready. So that's great. Tonight, our house will be open at 7, and then tomorrow night we're going to the camps for Hub, and so I'll post about that. Next Sunday night we're gonna do like a split night where the guys will just go do something and the girls will do something instead of everybody coming to our house. I think the girls are still gonna go to our house, but they're gonna do girl things, and so I don't know what the guys are gonna do yet. I haven't thought about it. I'll probably figure it out like Sunday afternoon. But anyways, I think that's all. It also just occurred to me that we were supposed to do the Mission Connect thing today. Totally forgot. So maybe we'll do that next week. So we'll keep that in mind, and I'll give you a heads up on that. All right, I think that's all. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 7. We're going to try to get through the whole chapter. It's 40 verses, so we'll do our best. I'm kind of prepping just to not, because I have a lot of notes, and so we'll see how it goes. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, one thing about 1 Corinthians 7, let's just go ahead and clear the air here. We're going to talk about sex this morning. And so, 1 Corinthians 7, it's a lot about sex, and we're talking about it because we're studying 1 Corinthians 7. And so, I have never before, currently now, just done a study of 1 Corinthians 7, mostly because I was like, what is sex? And then I just skipped it. But then I looked at it now, and I was like, man, this probably is a good thing to study. It's in the Bible, so it's certainly a good thing to study. But we should study it. And so we're going to. And we'll try to get through as much as we can. Not all of it is about that. There's a lot of it just about marriage in general. And so we'll talk about it as we go. So anyways, let's go ahead, just shake it out, clear the air. That's what we're talking about today. All right. Let's start in verse 1. Can someone read verses, let's see, let's just do 1 through 7.
concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by an agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as I myself am. Each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another.
Okay, so we're going to start here in verse 1. Now concerning the things about which you wrote. So we're kind of changing topics. We've been talking about a few different things, mostly things that Paul has been like, hey, Chloe's people told me this, and that's a problem. And so that was in chapter 1. But now he's saying, like, now here's some things we need to address concerning things about which you wrote. So they've kind of had some correspondence back and forth. Paul's written a letter to them. They wrote a letter back. Hey, here's some things we don't understand, whatever. And now Paul's answering some of those questions. So it's going to be a little sporadic in topics he covers. Like in chapter 7, he's going to cover this and sex and marriage. But in the next chapter, it's like, but can I eat meat? Like, how's that work? And so it's going to be, he's just like question after question, answering a lot of them. Now, he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, I think that's like a Corinthian, you know, there's been a couple times, like with the all things are lawful for me kind of idea, where it was like something that the Corinthians were just saying and kind of grappling with, like, is this true and how do we use it? I think this is one of those sayings, a lot of people do, where Paul is not actually saying it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but that this is what's being, like, discussed, like, in Corinth. So, and this is going to answer this question, is like, why would Corinth ask about this in the first place? So what's happening around them to cause Corinth to ask, like, how does this work? Well, so we've got some philosophers in Stoicism, if you know what Stoicism is, and they believe that sex, even within marriage, was only for the purpose of procreation, but it was never for pleasure. That was a sign that you were less spiritual. And there's one Latin guy, he's a poet, and he basically described marriage as a relationship of duty. It was never something that was for pleasure. And so that's how they viewed it and how they, like, pushed, how they, I don't know, they kind of pushed this idea of, like, if you are having sex even within your marriage, then you're less spiritual because you have a need, and that makes you weaker. And so in chapter 7, Paul's goal is kind of to redefine marriage and sex and how it's a means more of just procreation. It's something that's like a good thing, not just a dutiful thing. And so this isn't like, chapter 7 is not just Paul's manifesto on marriage. He talks about it in several other places. But it does show a side of marriage where he's actively countering that thought. Is, what is that for? Like, well, why can't we have sex and when can have? So, verse 2, he says, because of immoralities, which is probably from chapter 6, verses 12 through 20, if you remember, where we had all this stuff about prostitution and, like, don't do that. And so, he's already talked about that. And so he said, now because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife. Each woman is to have her own husband. And so, he says, like, because there's temptation, there's desire, which is natural. Because there's desire, some of you are resorting to prostitution. That's bad. Instead, you each have your own husband or wife. Now, notice that there's a structure here that we're going to see a lot, all but 2 times, where when Paul gives an instruction, then each party is mentioned, the man and the woman, every time. And so he does it here immediately. Like, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband, because he portrays marriage as a mutual relationship, where each of you have obligations, each of you have a duty, but it's not just a dutiful relationship. It's like to fulfill each other's desires, to help each other. Well, he'll talk about more in a second, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. So in verses 2 through 4, he kind of talks about this idea. Each man is to have his own wife, each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so this whole thing is mutual. You are one flesh, which means your bodies and your desires and all of these are for each other now. So you get to verse 5. So he says, stop depriving each other. Now, that's happening because people in culture are saying like, hey, don't do that. Like you're weak and less spiritual and stuff if you're having sex, even if you're married. And Paul's like, you're being ridiculous. Like you're depriving each other of a natural desire. So stop depriving one another. Except, and this is one that we kind of carry on. Some of this is like he's addressing specific cultural things, and some of this is like, oh yeah, this still kind of makes sense. All of this makes sense. We're talking about marriage here. But he says, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again. And so, a couple things here. Paul's going to identify, or he's going to clarify that abstinence from one another is only acceptable if it's mutual agreement, you both agree, and it's for the purpose of prayer. Or is my alerts coming up on the screen, by the way?
Yeah.
Y'all didn't even tell me, you goobs. Oh my goodness. Alright, anyways. In my partner class that doesn't happen, but I think it's because it's Apple TV. Anyways. Okay, so here's the except. Except by agreement, and only for a time. And that time is so that you can devote yourselves to prayer. That's the only reason that you would abstain from one another. And you have to agree on it. Now, why? Like, why would it be for the purpose of prayer? I think because any fast that's done is done with a purpose, right? Especially one as necessary as this, like as great of a need as this, then there needs to be a reason why it doesn't happen. And so, Paul kind of portrays sex as a weapon. But it's not a weapon against each other, and it can never be. It's a weapon against Satan. It is strictly to combat temptations presented by Satan. It is how two people making one flesh defeat Satan's attempts to break apart what God has declared to be good and put together. And so I thought that was kind of a cool image of like, this is how we defeat the temptations of Satan, is with each other. And that's the only way that should ever stop. It is the only reason that should never happen, like that we should abstain, would be prayer. And otherwise, that is our weapon against Satan. And so Paul recognizes it's only necessary because we have a lack of self-control. Look at the end of verse 6. You come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. So the concession is we all lack self-control. And if one had complete self-control over sexual desire, marriage may not be necessary. And so this is why Paul's instruction is a concession rather than a command. This is not a command that we be married. This is a concession, he says. Nowhere in the Bible is it a command to be married. However, most people want to be married for companionship and sex. And so we typically struggle in these departments when it comes to self-control. So we get how Paul sees it in verse 7, where he says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, and one in this manner and another in that." So it appears that Paul is celibate at the time. Not that Paul is married but choosing to be celibate. That's the whole issue here, right? But he seems to be unmarried completely. Now, this is kind of beside the point, but I thought it was interesting to think about, is that a lot of people, some people, think that Paul was married at one point. It'd be really hard to be a Pharisee and like to rise up in the ranks in Judaism if you weren't married at some point, because it was like pretty much like you have to be married if you're a Jew. And so, what would have happened to his wife? I'm not sure. Maybe she passed. Maybe he was never married at all. You know, the Bible never says. And so this is just purely speculation here. But in this case, that would mean that Paul would be a widower, which is kind of going to make sense with what we read after, whether that's the case or not. Okay, you can take that or you can chunk it if you want. It's something we can't know. But what we know is that Paul is celibate, and he considers that to be a gift. He says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God." It's like, I had this gift that I have everything under control here. Like, I'm content with how I am, and he seems to consider that to be a gift. I think it makes Paul especially qualified. This gift that he has, something given, not earned, is that he's able to be an apostle and fulfill his duty and travel the world without any kind of distraction or divided interests, using his words that we'll see later. And for this reason, I think he's especially equipped. But he's wishing for more people to be able to achieve this control over their sexual desire and then have freedom from it. And so this is why Paul doesn't need to be married. He's content in his status where he is. Now, sometimes, I've heard this verse abused a lot. Sometimes I've heard this verse to kind of be like, you're more spiritual if you are able to live without having these sexual desires. I don't know if you've heard it kind of used this way, but I have. And I think that's actually what Paul is combating in this chapter. So it's kind of ironic that we read this like, oh, it's better to not be married at all. We're just all too weak. It's like, no. That's actually what Paul is actively saying. This is not the case. And it actually seems that Paul is talking about marriage as though it is a gift. He says, "Yet I wish..." There's another ladybug. Oh my goodness, how many ladybugs are up here? He says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So one is content without being married, and one needs that. And he seems to say both are gifts. Yeah, Cole.
It almost seems like he's saying that his gift is that he doesn't have that desire for sex, period. And maybe that's not true. Maybe I'm reading into it so much, but it almost seems as though he's saying, like, I don't have that desire. I don't have that interest. Not so much to me that it's necessarily like, oh, I don't want to be married. It almost seems like he's just saying, I'm not interested in that. I have no interest in sexual desire. And that would be a gift. Like, I could see how that would be a gift and a really good boon of not having any interest in that would be a very helpful thing to have as a man who travels all over the place, especially like to Corinth and these other cities, like where prostitution is huge.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a distraction at all. So I can see where he's coming from that, while also marriage as a tool, because otherwise, yeah, it does very much seem like, well, if you have sexual desires, you're just not as good as me. Like,
Yeah.
that does seem like the way he's putting that.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. Is that I don't know if it's that like he's just completely void because it's kind of a natural thing, but it's more so of like I'm content like I am. Like I'm not like running out searching for this. Like it's not really a big temptation for me. Like kind of I would think it's like how each of us have our own kind of things that we may struggle with more than another. Well, like Paul is just I don't really have this strong desire. Like I've got it under control. It's not a big temptation, and that is a gift. All right, so to this point, let me ask you, to this point, has there been anything that has stood out regarding how marriage should be versus how our culture speaks of it? Is there anything that has stood out to you? Like, this is what Paul says, but this is pretty different than what our culture tends to think of it. Yeah.
It really strikes me, that dichotomy that Paul includes every time when talking about marriage. You read verses such as this one, and then I think it's also in Ephesians, where it says,
Like husbands love your wife, like that section? Like the rest of the church?
yeah, the wife does not have control over her body, but the husband does, and then the husband doesn't have control over his body, but the wife does. I mean, it's a biblical concept, but it's uncomfortable to say that first part because of just the culture in which we live in and the emphasis that's put on just intense individual autonomy and intense individual freedom, that it's not right, and it seems to be skewed over to one side because it's not right for women to be controlled by men, but if men were to be controlled by women, that's okay. That seems to be what the culture is saying.
In some places and some voices, and sometimes they're louder voices, but yeah, and you make a good point about individualism. I think Corinth has that same kind of struggle that we have of seeing ourselves hyper individually, and where like my body's mine, your body's yours. But in marriage, while that's obviously the case in like I don't know, physical matters, but like that's not the case when you're one flesh. And so to have a good marriage, you really can't see it that way. But that does go against some of what our culture says about marriage. Sure. Anything else?
I think it's just interesting the depriving one another part, because in today's culture, a lot of people deprive one another in the sexual aspect to get their way, whether it's in an argument or if it's something that they want. And Paul's like, that's stupid, don't do that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so actually, I was talking this over with Isabella. She was like, don't say it to women. Because she was like, that's like, I don't know, apparently something I want to talk about a lot. I didn't know that. I've never been in women's classes. But I read it. I was like, dude, this is like a sword. Like, get wrecked, Satan. And she was like, don't say that. But I said it anyways. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's often portrayed as a means of leverage one over another. And Paul says that can never, ever, ever be the case. It can only ever be a means of leverage over the enemy, which is not one or the other. It is not the husband or wife. And so I think that's a really good point to bring up. That it's a way to fight off Satan, not each other. And it's also something that is considered like, in our culture, is considered like a result of being close to each other. When Paul says this should be something that you use as a weapon against Satan. Like, it's not a result of being close to each other. It is like how to create closeness. Like, this is how you get closer to each other so that Satan doesn't, or so that Satan's temptation doesn't affect you. And so it's not a result of being close. It's how you get close. It's a weapon. So I thought that was interesting too. Okay, let's keep moving. We're totally not going to make it to the chapter. I can send you my notes if you want, but we'll just go as we go. Because I want to read verses 8 through 11.
But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife.
Okay, so a couple things here. He says, I say to the unmarried, which there's a couple options for what like he could really be referring to here. Maybe it actually is just all unmarried people and also widows. A lot of people think, though, that we're talking about widowers here because there's not a word for widowers at this point in the Greek language. There will be later. And so he'd be like, widowers and widows, maybe, okay? All we have is the word for unmarried. But he says the unmarried, the widowers thing is like, there's been this pattern of like men and women all throughout the text, right? So it kind of makes sense, but anyways, take that how you will. And widows, those who have already lost their husband. And so Paul says it's better to remain as you are. Be content without marriage. And if you cannot live the celibate lifestyle that Paul is living, then Paul says it's better to find someone else to marry than to burn with passion. So it says it's better to live as I am and just be in control of it all. But if you're not, then it's better to marry than to burn with passion and desire. And so you just need to decide which one's going to be best for you so that you can serve the Lord. Okay, then in verses 10 and 11, he says, to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. Now, remember, and this, I'm going to write these down above here, so if you're taking notes, this will probably be something good to write down, but he's already talked about this in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, and you can reference Malachi 2, where God says he hates divorce, for Jesus' words. What Paul's saying is like, he's about to give us his own advice for a lot of the letter, or for a lot of this section. But for this particular verse, he says, actually regarding divorce, Jesus has already talked about this. So let me tell you what Jesus said. Not I, Jesus said that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried. And so that kind of calls us to, let's see, Matthew, I know it's really bad, but just trust Matthew 5, 31 and 32. Matthew 5, 31 and 32, where he says, if you're going to leave your spouse, then you're not permitted to marry another. So Jesus has already talked about this. And so Paul's just bringing it up. This is what Jesus said. Don't leave your husband. But if you do leave, then she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And that the husband should not divorce his wife. So it's like, and the same for the husband. You should be divorcing each other. Now, starting verse 12, we're getting, that's the like foundational principle. And he's going to continue the command, like mutuality in marriage, man and woman. But now he's going to get into like, okay, but here's some advice from my side for your specific situation. And the specific situation is, at least in verses 12 through 16, is how to handle religiously mixed marriages. You have believers and unbelievers. Yeah, go ahead.
So it says, he says, I, not the Lord. But it is in the Bible. So how are we to reconcile the fact that this is divinely
David, you're
inspired?
getting ahead of me,
Oh, I'm
David.
sorry.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to get there. Nah, it's all good. We're going to talk about this in a second. That's why I made a point with the first part, though. So when we got to this one, it would make more sense. Okay, so let's read verses 12 through 16, and then we'll answer that question to start.
To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
Okay, so let's start with the question. He says, but to the rest I say, to everybody else here in court, this is what Jesus said, but to everybody else, this is what I say, not Jesus. What's a solution for that? Anybody got any ideas? Okay, so you can always fall back on, well, Paul is inspired. And he does say at the end of this, hey, by the way, I do have the Spirit of God. And so he's like, this is my judgment, but I have the Spirit of God, verse 40. So, yeah, Judd.
The verses earlier he's referencing, and not necessarily like, yeah.
That's a really thank you for that. I see where you're going. So in the verses before this, he's like, oh, hey, Jesus actually answered this question. So let's go straight to what Jesus said. Here's what Jesus said. Okay. Now, here's what I'm going to say about this. This is what Jesus said, but this is what I'm saying. Now, we have to keep in mind, this is how you should always read the Bible. You can never isolate a verse, because if you isolate this verse, you're like, whoa, Paul spoke outside of Jesus. But if you look back, we already studied 6 chapters of Paul, where for all 6 chapters, he's multiple times said, by the way, I'm an apostle. Like I have been commissioned by Christ. Like I am the guy who can talk to you like this. And so in verse 12, he's saying, now Jesus said that stuff, this is what I said. And it's not an opposition of power or okay, let me write in the Holy Spirit, now let me like take that off and write this stuff, and then it's not that. He's just saying those were Jesus' words, and now these are mine for your situation. And some of this we're gonna read like a little bit later on. If we even get there, he's really gonna make it like make sure that you know like, and this is my opinion, okay? Like this is my thoughts. Like you take this how you will. He's gonna really emphasize that. This is not one of those places actually. So he says, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. So he's saying the goal of a difficult marriage, even one where you don't believe the same thing, is to remain together, coinciding with Jesus' teachings. Paul's never going to contradict. We need to keep that in mind. Now, one thing to note is that these are not believers who are like choosing to live with unbelievers. It's like you have a family, one spouse is converted, like is a Christian, and then the other spouse is not. And so now this spouse, who has already heard things and read things like chapter 5, verse 1, I think, that talks about not to associate with the immoral, the sexually immoral, or just the immoral in general. He says, I've already read this, and now I'm married to someone who's not a Christian, and so do I divorce? Or like, do I not divorce? Like, how does this work? So this is kind of the situation we're looking at. Okay, we got to keep everything in context. And he says the goal of this marriage, as it always is to remain together, what Jesus said. So he says, if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, and she says, yeah, I'll keep living with you, don't divorce her. And if a woman has an unbelieving husband, and that husband consents to living with her, she can't divorce him. Now the sending her husband away idea is interesting, because you basically could like just leave. You could literally just be like, hey, I'm gone, you're ugly, and then dip. That's true, by the way. Like, that was in a contract one time. And so, from that time. And so, it was like crazy stuff, and you just dip. And not even have to give a reason if you don't want to. And so, it's like sending her husband away. It could be like, I'm keeping the house, and you're out of here. There's crazy stuff back then. And so, then we get to verse 14. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time in this section. I don't even know if we'll make it very far after this, because this is like the big ticket item in this chapter, is how do we approach this question. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. And the next verse we'll spend more time on, but let me ask you this. In this verse, in verse 14, what do you think that the verse is saying? And are there any clues in the text that can maybe help you find an answer? If someone were to just come up to you and say, hey, we read this far up to here, what does this mean? What would be an answer? Okay, let me ask this. You already know things about the Bible, right? You already have read at least some of it. Can someone be made holy or sanctified without Christ? Okay, no. That's a principle all throughout the Bible. And so Paul is not going to contradict that. And so that's something you need to keep in mind, is that if something in the Bible is said a ton of times, then we need to be extremely hesitant to ever say that it's contradicted somewhere. And so this one instance does not contradict what the rest of the Bible has to say about holiness. But it does talk about influence. So he says, the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. Maybe a better translation, but another way to translate it would be like made holy. And what we're talking about is, Paul has already said not to associate with the immoral person in chapter 5, verse 1, for fear of defilement. Remember how the Jews had kind of like clean and unclean kind of things? In a way, Paul kind of carries that over to talk about how we interact with sin and how we need to not associate ourselves with people who know the goodness of God and are actively rebelling against it. Now, what about if I'm already married to this person? Am I at risk of being defiled? Should I leave the marriage because of that? Well, no, Paul says to remain in the marriage, and then he says here's a reason, is that the holiness of Jesus transfers. It's kind of an interesting thought. The holiness never transfers, actually, until Jesus. If you read the Old Testament, it's always unclean that can affect you, but holiness can't. And so in this case, we have, when Jesus comes, holiness transfers to others. Okay, so we, who are called to be holy as God is holy, are in a marriage. And marriage is sacred. And you can't abandon it just for fear of becoming unclean. So what's happening is, by being one flesh with one who is sanctified by Christ, then the unbelieving spouse is considered sanctified. Now, not sanctified by the blood of Jesus. They're not believers, okay? And they're not experiencing the blessings and salvation that comes by the cross. But they are influenced by their believing spouse. And this influence is intended to bring the spouse to Christ. The believing spouse is the source of holiness in the household. It's the only representation of it. And so Paul says, if you're a believer, remain in the commitment that you have made. Stay as you are. It's kind of like a theme of the chapter. And allow your influence to sanctify, so to say, your spouse and your kids, who are considered unclean without you. And so this isn't like you are saving your spouse just by being married to them. We would know that would be untrue based on the entire Bible. But what he is saying is you have the opportunity to influence your spouse. And so as long as your spouse is willing to give you that opportunity, to consenting to live with you, then take advantage of your opportunity. Same with their kids. Verse 15. This is the interesting one. It says, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Okay. Did Paul just contradict the command that Jesus made? And does he give a new exception here? No. Okay. What's the What's your rationale behind not? Does anybody else see how it could definitely look like he's definitely making a new exception? Okay, so what would be your answer for why that's not the case?
Well, it doesn't say that you're divorced or that you're allowed to remarry or anything. It just says if they want to leave, you have to let them leave. And God has called you to peace. So you have to find peace in the fact that you're now stuck being single effectively unless they come back.
See, but you skipped the main part of the verse in that explanation, which is the brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases. The believing spouse is not under bondage when the unbeliever leaves.
My translation says enslaved, so I didn't really.
It's a better
associate
translation.
That with,
What translation are you using?
ESV 25.
Okay, so ESV probably gets it better because enslaved is a better usage of the word. Okay, so what's the explanation here? A lot of people look at this. A lot of people look at this and say that Paul is contradicting the words of Jesus, and they readily give you this stance, like, "Hey, Paul quotes Jesus and says, but here's one more." And we might know the words of Jesus, know how Jesus expects marriages and divorces and remarrying and stuff to go, but then get to this verse and be like, I don't know what to do. And maybe some of you are having that experience right now. And so what it appears to say is, if you're converted to Christianity and your spouse decides to leave you, you're good. Go remarry again. But what it really says is a different story. So I think the question lies in what not under bondage or not enslaved means. So let me ask you this. What are some ways that we could understand the phrase not under bondage or not enslaved? What could this mean? Any ideas?
A bondservant is one who's taken an oath to the master, and so kind of in the same way, you take an oath to your husband or wife, you wouldn't be held to that oath anymore, maybe?
Okay, so part of this could be, like, you're not under bondage to the oath or obligation that you made to your spouse anymore. Okay, what else? Yeah.
Paul uses this language heavily in Romans, talking about being in bondage to sin or in bondage to Christ. And so it would seem to fit with the argument before or the argument that's coming later, where if you are not married, then you are not obligated to serve another person. Now you are free to serve Christ. So you're not under bondage to another person, you're now under bondage to Christ. Now if marriage helps you, if being bonded to another person helps you in that bondage to Christ, then that's good. But in this case it does not. So then it is dissolved, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Okay, y'all have had some pretty good answers. There's a few ways, and y'all have hit kind of two of them. You kind of blended them a little bit, but kind of two of them. Another way is just saying you're not under bondage of singleness or celibacy, which would be most likely, at least how I would first read it. It's like, oh, so you're good to go. You're free to marry again. Y'all have hit other explanations, so they're probably more accurate. So how can we find an answer? This is like how to study your Bible 101 that we're about to do, okay? We actually have like 5 minutes, so when the next bell rings, ignore it. With all this in mind, how can we find an answer? Okay, so we're going to look at the historical context, and then we're going to look at Paul's immediate context, and we'll go through it pretty quickly. So this is why it's how to study 101, because we don't just assign meaning to words. Okay, like we go and find, this is what it would have meant to the audience, to the original audience. We assign meaning to words, then you get Paul making a whole new exception. And so, what's happening? So let's start in the historical context and ask how was the term used, not under bondage? How was it used in the time? And so literally it means not enslaved, actually. It's like the word for servant or slave in a little different way, but that's pretty much how it is. Meaning not enslaved. And in Paul's world, when you're discussing marriage in the context of marriage and divorce, this phrase would have just meant to not be married. Philo talks about it that way, and Rufus and a few other like old guys, very, very old guys. In all of Jewish and like Greco-Roman divorce certificates, they had these little like papers. They were like, hey, you're divorced now. They would have all contained the words, I'll write this, but I don't want to. They all would contain the words, you are free to marry any man you wish. And that was like the main thing that needed to be in that doc, is like, you are free to marry anybody you want. So let's look at our immediate context here in the text. What can we take from what we know about history in that context to apply to the text and help us find some clues? Okay, so if not under bondage or not enslaved means to not be married, but being free alludes to having the ability to remarry, does Paul play on that distinction? Does Paul seem to be aware of this? I think so. So let's look at verse 39, because we're absolutely not going to get there. In verse 39, he says, a wife is bound, enslaved, married, as long as her husband lives. But if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes. That sounds like the divorce certificates, right? Like what we just read. She is free to remarry any man she wants. But Paul clarifies only in the Lord. So it's like it needs to be another believer. But Paul's already played on this idea. So that a wife is bound to her husband as long as her husband lives, reflecting Jesus' commands. But if he dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. Which seems to be a clear distinction here in how the words are used. Y'all following me? Bound versus free. You got bound is married, and free is I can go marry whoever I want. In Romans chapter 7, verse 3, Paul also says, like, if her husband dies, she is free from that law. Free. She can remarry. And so in the context of marriage, Paul only talks about freedom when he is talking about widows and the right to remarry. The husband died. Now the phrase under bondage, or not enslaved. So Paul doesn't use this phrase anywhere else when referring to marriage. So we kind of only have this instance of how Paul uses the phrase, and then we have all these historical usages of it. And they all attest to it meaning to be married. If you're enslaved, then you're married. Which is probably, maybe that's where we get the whole like ball and chain idea, is like they've always talked about it as slavery, but they also had really bad marriages. So anyways, and so this word, the enslaved idea, it typically refers to a law or an obligation in Paul's writings. When he talks about enslaved, kind of like how David was earlier, it's a law or an obligation that you're under, like the Mosaic law. And so in this instance, the law that one is under and the obligation that one is under seems to be the Lord's command. And then look at verses 10 and 11. The command is, let me get up here. The command is, don't separate. But if the unbeliever separates, let them go. Verses 10 and 11, and then verses 12 through 15. And then you could be at peace with God, knowing you did what you could, at the end of verse 15. And so, Paul recognizes that there is a real possibility for divorce in Corinth. And he doesn't forbid it, he only forbids remarriage. So the deserted spouse, the believer who was left by the unbeliever, they took off, and the believer is just left. They can find peace in Paul's words. You can be at peace with God even though a divorce happened, because you tried. You did what you could. Your spouse left. Now you can be at peace with God. And this should be comforting words, not restricting or unjust, but comforting. Knowing, okay, I can still be at peace with God. Why? Because that's what's most important. Now we don't really have time to continue on too far past this, but I do want to at least mention that by the end of this, Paul puts all of this into a like forever perspective, and says, let's see, kind of more. I think around verses 32 through 40 or so. Actually, a little bit before this, yeah, closer to like verses 25 through 31. He puts marriage into an eternal perspective. And we've talked about this a lot, but he does it in the context of marriage and says we should be seeing our marriages as our, within the context of heaven. Always within the context of heaven. And always in the context of forever. So that's why Paul says, like, for him it's better to be single than to be married. Is because Paul is so focused on heaven. And that he doesn't really need to be married, and so he doesn't. Now he says at the end of this, and I think around verses 38 through 40, somewhere around there, he says, like, look, if it's better for you to marry so that you can serve the Lord, like, do that. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. So you need to be married so that you can serve the Lord. But if you have this gift, and nobody's forcing you, nobody in culture is forcing you, but you have this gift of celibacy and you choose it, and then you can serve the Lord, then do that. Because then your interests aren't divided, and you can actively serve the Lord. But everything that you do, and he talks about like buying and purchasing, he talks about being married, and he talks about having emotions. And he says all of these things are earth things. And so all of them are things that you're going to do because you are on earth. But he says it is all within the framework of I am detached from the earth. Like I am heaven bound, forever focused. And so we see our marriages that way. So I know that doesn't exactly cover this section, but that was probably a really big idea that I wanted to make sure we hit because Paul covers that a lot. And so it might be something for you to go back on and read. If you have any questions about this text, you're more than welcome to come ask me or get my notes or something if you want to study that on your own. Next week, though, we're going to jump into chapter 8, so we won't get to cover the rest of 7. So let me know if you want notes or anything. All right, thank y'all for hanging with me.